I start, I'll introduce my organisation. I work for the Prince's Regeneration Trust, which was founded in 1996 by His Royal Highness Prince Charles. The Prince is absolutely passionate about heritage and about cultural heritage in particular. And he started us as an organisation to help solve the problem with some of the really tricky heritage projects or non-projects that we have in the UK. We have several roles as an organisation that have changed over time. On the one hand, we are a capacity building charity. We support community groups to rescue their heritage and bring it back into sustainable use. We help them with the skills that they need. We help them to think strategically. We are a critical friend. We do all kinds of help with people to help themselves. We also act as a building preservation trust. Now, building preservation trusts are kind of the main vehicle for the regeneration of a great deal of heritage in the UK. And we have taken projects on ourselves and rescued buildings and craft skills and industries for sustainable use in the future. Our third role is a result of all of the experiences that we have had helping others and also doing projects ourselves, and we have the expertise to actually offer a consultancy service as well, and that's a way of diversifying our income as a charity as well. So we offer commercial consultancy and advice for projects that are attempting to regenerate. So this is what I'm going to talk about this morning. If you do have any questions at any point, or if whatever I say is not clear, please ask. I'm happy to be interrupted, and if we have time, I will take questions at the end as well. First of all, I'm going to repeat what we all pretty much already know here, which is about the real benefits of heritage-led regeneration. I'm going to give you a bit of an understanding of the UK context, because I think our situation is probably quite different to that of many European countries. And it's important to understand that in order to see why we do things the way that we do. I will give you all the way through examples of successful and unsuccessful regeneration projects. And then at the end I will wrap up by talking about what I think the main ingredients are for a successful project, what a fertile ground looks like for a really good regeneration project, and then give you some top tips from the experience that we have here in the UK. So, in the UK, heritage tourism generally is actually the 5th largest industry that we have. It represents about 2% of GDP. It employs almost 400,000 people. I mean, let's face it, nobody comes to the UK for that. There are also studies which show that certain industries actually gravitate towards historic buildings. We have a piece of research that was conducted in 2013 which has evidence which shows that particularly the creative industries and professional service industries, so people like architects and lawyers, they actually want to work in historic buildings. And so it's actually a really good focus for business, and businesses want to work in historic buildings, but those buildings need to be fit for purpose as well. For every pound generated by the public sector in heritage, it generates about £1.60 return, so it's 160%, I think, return. And the other thing to note is that most heritage in the UK is actually privately owned, and the heritage construction industry is worth £10 billion. The tourist industry is worth £18.4 billion, so it's a lot of money that we spend on heritage, and sometimes we don't even recognise that it's actually heritage. Heritage regeneration can have a catalytic effect, and the regeneration of a building in a deprived area can actually be the seed that starts a greater process. We've seen this particularly in deprived parts of the north of the country they were in very industrial areas and have declined dramatically in the last 60 or so years. These effects can also introduce new design if people think creatively about how to reuse old buildings. And they will attract inward investment and also, most importantly, jobs. And that's the thing that will sustain a community. So it's always important to remember about the catalyst that heritage can be. One of the things that is always increasing in thinking about heritage is actually the environmental aspects. Reusing old buildings is environmentally sustainable. It's much better than tearing them down and starting again. Sometimes particularly people with no experience of heritage, they think, oh, why would you keep that building? Get rid of it. Actually, the building was probably not designed to be wasteful, probably not designed to be cold and drafty. It's often a lack of maintenance which leaves buildings in trouble. And if you bear that in mind when you're working with buildings, it can often help you to persuade the people who need persuading that the building is worth keeping. So reusing buildings is environmentally sustainable. And bringing those buildings back into a modern standard, putting things like solar panels on the roof, that is sustainable. I also personally like old buildings because of the sense of scale. Being a Londoner, we're being dwarfed by skyscrapers at the moment. We have something like 270 skyscrapers with accepted planning permission to be built in London in the next 5 or so years. I prefer the human scale of the old buildings, and I think that's something that we shouldn't underestimate. Finally, an area that the UK is starting to look at much more critically is the area of health and well-being. Heritage is starting to prove to add value to local places. If your building is historic, if your building is in a historic area, it's very likely to be more expensive than somebody else's. It also reinforces identities and it brings people together. The University of Newcastle has actually done some studies and found that people who live in historic areas are statistically actually much more likely to have a sense of place, a very strong sense of place, and a stronger sense of pride as well. So these are things to bear in mind. And also, heritage is the backdrop to our lives. A lot of people value places not because they're historic in themselves, but because of what happened to them in those places. So that's always a really important thing to remember about the human element of heritage. Right. Okay. The UK context. I don't know whether you have all seen the UK Chamber of Commerce campaign. Heritage is great, industry is great, new business is great. It's a Great Britain campaign. It was very successful during the Olympics, and as you can see, one of our most iconic heritage sites is also featured in the campaign. Stonehenge, in case you didn't know. So I'm going to give you a bit of the UK context by talking about what I mean when I say a heritage asset, because it's quite a broad term. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who the owners of heritage are in the UK. Who in the UK is responsible for protecting and defending heritage? And then I'll talk a little bit about how heritage regeneration is paid for in the UK. And I hope to give you some ideas. Right. So heritage assets in England. The first thing to bear in mind is that, in the UK we have actually 4 devolved administrations. We have England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Each of those administrations has its own heritage advisory body. I have worked for Historic England, which is the body that is the government's expert advisor on the historic environment in England. They advise the government on the impact of government's policies on the historic environment, and they also make recommendations to government about what things should be nationally protected. It's really important to make this point because a lot of people think that Historic England makes the decisions. It doesn't. It's the government that makes the decisions about what is and what is not protected. For example, we had a minister a couple of years ago who absolutely hated 20th century architecture. So we didn't get any 20th century architecture. So there are lots of things that are called heritage assets in the UK. There are buildings, and if they're nationally protected, they can be listed at grade 1, 2-star or 2. 1 is hugely important, 2-star is pretty important, 2 is actually pretty common. My mother lives in a grade 2 building. They can be, if they're not nationally protected, they can be locally protected by the local planning authority. Now the local planning authority is effectively the local government, and they are the ones who make the decisions about changes made to heritage in their areas. They could be a registered park and garden or a landscape, a registered battlefield, a scheduled ancient monument. This generally applies to below-ground heritage or ruins. They could be protected wrecks, conservation areas, again a local designation. If you have an area in your local authority, the character and appearance of which it is desirable to preserve and enhance, then you can exercise some form of control about changes that happen in that area. To give you an example, if you have an area with beautiful houses, I'll give you some examples later, you could issue a restriction which prevents people from putting satellite dishes on the front of the house. So that would be a restriction that you can impose in a conservation area, because it would otherwise be death by 1,000 cuts. If one person does it, then 50 people do it, and then all of a sudden the whole area is not so nice. And then, of course, lastly, we have World Heritage Sites, which I will also tell you briefly about. We have 396,538 heritage assets on the list in England alone. 370,000 of those are buildings. 2% are grade 1, so the most important listing. 6% are grade 2 star, and 92% are grade 2. And the grade actually determines how much you can do to the building and who makes the decision about what you can do to the building. So here's some pretty pictures and examples. The first picture at the top, I think you can probably recognize it, Buckingham Palace. That's a grade 1 listed building for very obvious reasons. It's architecturally very significant, historically very significant. Next to that we have a pretty standard looking church in the southwest of England. That's grade 2 star. Churches are often the oldest buildings in their communities, hundreds, possibly over 1,000 years old. They tell the story of the community, and we have a real crisis in the UK coming because of the secularism. We have 14,000 listed churches, many of which no longer have congregations, and we need to find creative ways to keep those buildings in use, to keep people clearing the gutters and cleaning them and making sure that the roof stays on, all that kind of stuff. So it's a big, big challenge. To the left of the church, we have a very typical English timber-framed cottage, grade 2, very picturesque, very typical really. Below that we have, does anybody recognise the site at the bottom, the big circle? That's Avebury. If you ever go and see Stonehenge, don't bother, go and see Avebury. It's much, much bigger, much, much more interesting and much, much more impressive. But Avebury is part of the same World Heritage Site as Stonehenge. It's a giant landscape of ancient sites. Avebury has a Roman road going through the middle. It has a medieval village in the middle. It's a very, very ancient stone circle as well, so it's like layers and layers of different types of heritage. World Heritage being like the biggest designation that you can get. This industrial monstrosity is grade 2 star listed. It's the Grimsby Ice Factory, and it's in the world of refrigeration, it is king, apparently. The Grimsby Ice Factory was making ice on an industrial scale for the fishing industry in the northeast of England, and the building still has all of its machinery inside. It's really, really significant, but it's also stuck in the middle of an industrial port, and the Port Authority doesn't want anything to do with it. And this is an example of an owner with the responsibility to look after the building, not actually doing anything about it yet. And the bottom is my favourite example. This is my local pub. This building is not listed, but it is in a conservation area, and the local residents, as you can see, are very keen to protect it. We have an epidemic in London of pubs being purchased by private developers and then turning them into apartments. It's much more financially lucrative than keeping it as a pub. So the locals here have actually created something which is a local designation called an asset of community value to ensure that this remains a pub. And so the pub is protected in a sense, even though historically and architecturally may not be that special, it's going to stay a pub, which I'm very happy about. So some of the legal frameworks, it's really important to note, I often find that there's a big distinction within the UK between, within Europe, countries with common law and countries with Napoleonic law. UK is based on common law, which means that the landowner is the boss. The landowner is king, the landowner has primacy. Any legislation you impose is taking away the rights of the landowner and will be fought tooth and nail. So that's always really important to bear in mind. You know, in a lot of other countries you can say, well, the heritage is our national patrimony, it belongs to the state. In the UK it's not quite that simple. But it also means that owners are responsible for taking care of their heritage, and there are things that we have in place to enforce that if we have to. So let me go on to show you some more ideas of owners. See, lots of good pictures. On the top, that lovely green field, That is also the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site. That's an area called Salisbury Plain in the southwest of England. It is owned by the Ministry of Defence, which is one of the largest landowners in the country, and it is used for military training. You can see there in the foreground a mound with some white flags around it. That's a Bronze Age burial mound, and they put the flags there so that the tanks don't run over it. Next to that, you have a lovely brutalist monstrosity called Balfron Tower, which is grade 2-star listed, designed by Erno Goldfinger in the 1960s, in the possession of one of our local councils. It was social housing, and very neglected for a very, very long time. It became a bit of a blight. A lot of people look at these buildings and go, oh, horrible, prisons in the sky. They were designed to be villages in the sky, and the problem is in the management, not in the design. This building has actually been leased to a social housing authority who are now spending a lot of money to refurbish the building and will hopefully get social and affordable housing tenants in there. At the top, some of you might recognise St Pancras Station. It's the home of the Eurostar now. It's a great big Victorian train station, one of several in London. In the 1960s, this building was practically derelict and they wanted to pull it down because they thought it was hideous. So it just goes to show how times change. It was in the ownership of the railway authorities. It's now shared space, really. It's got a private hotel, it's got private apartments, it's got a big shopping centre, it's still got railway infrastructure in it, so it's an example of shared space and heritage. In the middle, on the side over there, a typical Cotswolds village. Each of those houses is probably owned by an individual or rented by an individual, but they share a roof. So they have to work together to make sure that that roof stays on. Right in the centre, we have the Locarno Room, which is one of the entertaining rooms in the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office. An absolutely incredible building in the centre of London, designed to impress because it was for the Foreign Office. So you can just imagine the dignitaries from all over the world coming in and being like, wow. This building is very, very high security and it's very difficult to get in. And you kind of ask yourself, well, if it's the patrimony of the nation, if it belongs to the people, how come we can't see it? And our solution to that is something called Heritage Open Days, which we have every September. It's a long weekend where heritage buildings all over the country are opened by volunteers so that members of the public can come and see them. And last year we had nearly 4 million visits over a long weekend. Something like 40,000 volunteers, so it's pretty impressive. Right at the bottom, that sad building with the van in front of it is called New Cumnock Town Hall. It's a town hall in rural Scotland, which the local authority, for lack of funding, was unable to maintain, so they just shut it down. And it's a real sad case because they basically said, we don't care what happens to it, we can't afford it. And fortunately, the Prince of Wales actually, it's not far from one of his residences, and he got one of his charities to actually acquire the building. They had a huge community consultation event where over 35 community groups actually were present, and they all expressed a desire to use the building in different ways. And the funding was found through private donations to refurbish the building, and it is now used every day. It's a really good success story. And the interesting thing about that was that they did not use public money, which is an interesting model for us, because I think that's one that we're going to have to consider more and more. In the middle on the bottom is a power station. We have one too. We have several. This is Bankside Power Station, which was in operation until the mid-20th century, right in the heart of London. It's now a national museum, the Tate Modern, and hugely successful. This space is really inspirational, actually. I would really recommend that you go and see it if you ever go to London. And then finally, on the bottom, we have a typical English country house. This one is called Stowe. It's owned by the National Trust, which is a national charity which looks after historic sites. And they also are a huge landowner in the UK, and their slogan is forever for everyone, which is quite a nice one. The interesting thing about this building is that not only is it a stately home that you can visit, it's also an independent school, a very expensive independent school. So that shared use and that partnership ensures that the building continues to be used and is appreciated by many people. Right, management. So as I said, most management of heritage in the UK is done at a local level. Local planning authorities make decisions about changes that are made to the heritage. And the degree of change and the sort of importance of the asset will determine whether that change is acceptable or not. So if it's grade 1, you know, it's really important. You have to think very carefully about what you're changing and how and why. And it's not just about architecture, it's about significance. What is it that makes that building nationally important? Sometimes it's not the architecture, sometimes it's the people who live there, sometimes it's the history, sometimes, you know, it can be all sorts of different things. And there are different parts of the building that can be more important than others. And so that will also inform how you change it. If a building is highly graded, it is referred up to the national advisory body. So in the case of England, it would be Historic England, who have advice. They can give advice on what they think the changes mean, whether they're good or not. Ultimately, the decision is made at a local level. Unfortunately, the decisions are not always consistent. This is as a result of heritage being kind of a subjective thing sometimes. Some people think that a building is far more precious than it is. Some people think that the changes are far more dramatic than they are. So it can be inconsistent across the UK. It also has to do with the degree of expertise that the local authority may have. And I have to say that in the UK, the degree of expertise in conservation is decreasing dramatically at the local authority level because of funding cuts. But I think the thing to bear in mind is that conservation is the management of change. It's not about preserving something in a block of ice. It's about ensuring that it will be here in 100 years. And we need to make sure that it is useful to modern day people and to people of the future to ensure that it stays. We have enforcement. If an owner of a building neglects their building, it is possible to issue what's known as a repairs notice. The local authority will basically say you have to do this and this and this and this to the building to keep the roof on. If the owner fails to do that, then the local authority can actually can do the repairs itself, and then the bill goes to the owner. That's a risk for a lot of local authorities who are already very worried about money. So it doesn't happen very often. And there are means to support that financially from central government. It's also the precursor to what we call a compulsory purchase order, where an owner is actually stripped of the asset. And it will be sold, but it will be sold for a minimal amount. And then the local authority takes on the asset. Again, huge liability. So it doesn't happen very often, because quite often when you CPO a building, it's already lost its roof. So that's a lot of a cost that you're taking on. So it's a tricky one. Conservation deficit is something we talk about a lot in the UK. When you have a building that costs £5 and it's going to cost £50 to put the roof back on, that difference is what we call the conservation deficit. Conservation deficit is the thing that stops the market from addressing the problem with buildings very, very often, because it's not financially viable. And what we have in the UK is ways and means of actually addressing the conservation deficit to bring the building back to the market where private individuals would be interested. We have lots of ways to do this. Lots of government bodies provide grants. There are, and there won't be for much longer, regional grant schemes and EU grant schemes. But I would say the primary funder for the UK, and this is hugely important for the heritage sector in the UK, is the Heritage Lottery Fund, the HLF. Since 1994, the HLF has contributed £7.6 billion in grants to heritage projects in the UK, to almost 42,000 projects. And that ranges from like £1,000, oral history project to multi-million-pound museum extensions. The HLF is the only game in town sometimes. It's the main funder for heritage in the UK. I don't know what we would do without it. The HLF is funded by the National Lottery. So people who buy lottery tickets are paying for this grant scheme. And it is increasingly in demand. There is also private money, and this is an area that we really need to increase in the UK. Private individuals, bear in mind, they own 80% of the heritage, so they're the ones who are mostly paying for it. And, they want to. Corporate support, there are corporate sponsors. We ourselves have an education program which is sponsored by a couple of architectural and consultancy firms. There's private philanthropy. Now, the heyday of private philanthropy in the UK was the Victorian period. We're hoping to rebuild that, but at the moment the Americans are putting us to shame. They do it really well. There are trusts and foundations that offer grants, and the real thing that's coming up is crowdfunding and community shares, where people who have a vested interest in the building invest in the building's future, which is one to look out for. So I'm going to counter through these because I know I'm running out of time. At the top in the black and white and the photo immediately beneath is the Great Western Railway workshop at Swindon, which is now a private designer outlet mall. And as you can see, I don't know whether you can see the yellow crane in the middle of the shopping mall. Some of the industrial heritage is still in the building, which is quite nice. You can remember what it used to do. The building at the top with the lights is the Camden Roundhouse. It was a locomotive turning station, and a bit like the power station that we saw last night, it was obsolete almost immediately after being built. It became a storage facility, and it's now one of London's most popular concert venues. It's fantastic. Up here we have a ruinous country house called Alton Towers, which is the location of one of the most popular theme parks in the UK. And the theme park happens in the grounds around the house, and they've actually started to use the house for things like Halloween and haunted house and that kind of thing. So they're using the heritage in new ways without necessarily having to reconstruct it. Down at the bottom, that enormous crowd that you can see there, I think that was an Oasis concert in 1998. But right at the top, you can see a country house, and that is Nebworth. A lot of country houses which are still in private ownership are trying to find ways to diversify their income to keep the roof on. And concerts and festivals and that kind of thing, events in the grounds are one way that they are doing this. This is one of my favourites. This was an old mental asylum called Claybury Hospital in Essex, which, it was a huge site, was actually converted to residential, and the chapel was turned into a gym, as you can see. So you can kind of be zen when you're in the church swimming. And then here's another example of a reuse of a church. This church is actually still consecrated. This is St Paul's in Bristol, and it's run by an education company called Circa Media, who do clown schools and acrobatics. So they use the space, but you can still get married in there if you want to. Examples of government projects. These are of varying success. The top one is called Apthorpe House, which it was compulsorily purchased by the local authority and then handed straight across to Historic England, or English Heritage as they were then known, who spent £8 million putting the roof back on, or repairing the roof and doing various repairs to the building. It doesn't have light, it doesn't have electricity, it still needs a lot of work. So they spent £8 million, but then they sold it for 2.5. So they met the conservation deficit with public money. But this building was considered nationally significant enough for that to be a worthwhile investment. It's one of the most important Tudor and Jacobean palaces that we have in the country. And the owner was an absentee Libyan who nobody had ever heard of. And the only reason the roof didn't come off was because the gardener kept putting patches on for about 40 years. And in the end, he got a medal because he kept the building alive. Beneath that is another project. In the middle, you can see it's called the Shrewsbury Flax Mill, or the Ditherington Flax Mill, and it is the prototype to the skyscraper. It's one of the first iron buildings that we have in our country. And there you see it in the corner. It's in the process of being restored. This project is a giant master plan where the building is at the heart of the regeneration. There's going to be new business, there's going to be public space, there's going to be residential, there's going to be small business units, and all of this is going to be funded in lots of different ways by lots of different bodies to try and regenerate the whole area. This one is a tricky one. This is Denbigh Hospital, which was, it closed down, it was again another insane asylum. It was closed in the 1990s, sold to a private developer who didn't do anything with it except for strip out all of the valuable materials. And it accidentally caught fire about 5 times. In 2011, they issued an urgent works notice to the tune of £939,000, which is a lot of money for the local authority to pay just to keep this building standing. Ultimately, they compulsorily purchased it in 2015, and the local authority is now handing the building across to a building preservation trust, a charity who can access public funding to try and bring the building back to use. It's a huge site. It's probably going to be a lot of residential, which means there will be partnership with a private developer as well. But this one is definitely in trade, and it accidentally caught fire again in January. These are examples by what I suppose you would call NGOs, charities and trusts. At the top is another example that I just love. There is a charity in the UK called the Churches Conservation Trust that looks after churches whose congregations have dissipated, who disappeared. But they want to keep the church alive, they want to keep the church consecrated, and they try and keep the church open. That is an example of, I don't know if you can see, there are two beds in the middle of the nave. They call that champing, church camping. And it's possible to actually pay to stay in the church overnight, and you can have, between like 2 people for a romantic night or like 50 scouts. And you can stay in the church overnight. It's cheaper than a hostel, and it's quite atmospheric, and it's a way of generating income to maintain the building. Next to that, we have a fantastic example. This is called Astley Castle, where they've actually they built a house inside a ruin. This is developed by a charity that we have called the Landmark Trust, who take crazy buildings in the middle of the countryside and turn them into amazing holiday rentals. And the Landmark Trust are hugely successful. This building, I think, is booked out until 2018. You can't say that because it's so popular. This building here is called the Cleveland Pools. It's a Regency, so 18th century bathing pool in Bristol. And this group has actually recently crowdfunded £12,000 using a swimathon. So like local swimming groups and children and old people, they've all been like, sponsor me, I'm going to swim 100 meters for the pool. They raised £12,000, which is quite impressive when you think about crowdfunding and sponsor funding. Down on the bottom we have an example of the changes and the impact that the Heritage Lottery Fund can make. They've awarded £3.7 million to an industrial site in Cornwall. One of the things I think that's really key about this one is they're going to create 50 jobs on the site because they're going to have new business units for startups and that kind of thing. Breweries are really quite key right there. In the middle, we have Clevedon Pier. A pier is that thing that just juts out into the middle of the sea and you walk along it and you fish off it. They are really, really difficult to maintain because of the salt water and the metal, and they're just a nightmare. They catch fire all the time as well. The Clevedon Pier Trust they got a grant to create a new visitor centre and an event space and a restaurant so that the pier has a future, a viable future, that will hopefully ensure that the building can be maintained long term. Beneath that is the House Mill. This is an 18th century mill in the east of London which was used to help make gin, which was very popular at the time, increasingly popular now. The House Mill is an example of one of those projects that falters. It started, and then they realised that they had underestimated the engineering costs, so they stopped. And now they're gathering the forces again to try and start up again. They want to turn this into a really amazing museum and event space with a cafe. They have a cafe already, which is fantastic, but they need a bit more funding to get it going. And this is a very sad example, I'm afraid. This is Hadlow Tower, which received lots and lots and lots of funding to be restored. It was run by a charity called the Vivat Trust, who are similar to the Landmark Trust. It was for rent, you could stay in it. Unfortunately, the Vivat Trust didn't have a viable business model when the financial crash came. And they took out loans, which when those loans were withdrawn, meant that they actually folded. And that building went for sale. And I think it's privately owned now. So just an example of why it's so important to have a viable business model. Possibilities. So what is it that we're looking for when we're looking for viable business and viable heritage regeneration projects? I think first and foremost it's really important to ensure that the local government is on your side, that they're sympathetic at the very least and absolutely 100% behind you at the best. If they want to give you money, that's even better. You need strong leadership. You need someone with a vision who's going to drive this thing forward. But you also need to bear in mind that that vision is going to change because there are going to be people coming to the project with new ideas and new information. And you have to make sure that your project is resilient enough to evolve over the time. Because what you come up with in year 1 will not be what you have at the end of year 5 or 6. It's going to change. You need the enthusiastic support of local people. And you also need those local people to have support so that they know what they need to do and they have the skills and they have the advice that they need in order to deliver those projects effectively. There's no good having a bunch of people who are amazing at conservation if what you need is someone who knows how to run a shop. So you need to make sure you have the right people for the job. There have to be opportunities for income generation. If you are going to restore a building that has no purpose and no good use and no way of supporting itself, then you're just creating a problem. And for that reason, it really needs a robust business plan. And you need to be able to plan for what the end use is going to be. You need to be able to plan for what happens if the economy contracts, what happens if the economy expands. You've got to be ready for all of these possibilities. And there are always opportunities for intangible benefits, particularly things like meanwhile uses. I don't know whether you're familiar with the term. It's when you have a building that's not quite done yet, but you have art installations, or you have food festivals, or you have music, and you find ways to get people in, to be like, wow, this space is so cool, I want to come back when it's done. So meanwhile uses are really good, and people will appreciate that, and they will come back to you. And partnership is absolutely key. I know that's kind of what this whole conference is about, but it does actually, the saying is 2 heads are better than 1, and it's absolutely true. And you have people coming from different economic backgrounds, different fields, different industries. They can all help with ideas. It also ensures that not only will you have public funding, you can have private funding, you can have commercial funding, and you can have grants. So that whole package diversifies the money that is required for a project, and it makes it slightly more robust than if it's just one source of funding. With a lot of projects, it's useful to have an anchor tenant. So again, I talked about the end user. If you know how the building is going to be used, if you know who's going to use it and what they're going to use it for, you can plan for that. So with the example of the Grimsby Ice Factory, we had an anchor tenant, and we applied for the grant, and the grant was rejected. So we had to try again and think a new idea. So that's the other thing to bear in mind, is that you're never going to succeed every time the first time. The other thing to bear in mind is that these kinds of projects will probably only really have an opportunity to be regenerated once in a generation. So it's really important that what you do is high quality and it lasts, because you're not going to get another bite of the cherry in your lifetime. More examples of lovely solutions. These are railway arches under a railway station in London, which is now called the House of Vans. It's a skate park. It's a music venue, it's a bar, it's a cinema, all sorts of things. The spaces that used to be used for storage and then were used for antisocial behaviour, and now it's a huge community space. To the left of that is a church in Liverpool that was bombed during the Second World War. It has no roof, but they now use it for art installations, and it's become where before people were like, oh, the bombed out church. Now they're like, oh, it's St. Paul's. It's great, what have they got in there this week? It's a really different space. On the left, we have another church. In Bolton. Bolton is a largely immigrant area now. The majority of the population are Muslim. They have no use for a giant church. So what has happened is that they've created pods on the inside of the church without harming the fabric of the building, which has enabled them to have small business space, meeting space, classrooms, and it's become a community asset despite the fact that it's a Christian building. And it's now very, very treasured by the local community. In the middle on the left, we have somewhere in Birmingham called the Custard Factory. As it says, it used to be a factory that made custard, and it's now a destination in and of itself. Lots of beautiful buildings, little boutiques, little startup businesses, and people travel there to have a look around, and there are new businesses starting there all the time. In the middle, we have a really strong example of public and private cooperation. That's Oxford Castle, which was a prison, and is now a huge visitor attraction. It's got a museum in the prison, it's got a very fancy hotel in some of the prison cells, it's got restaurants, they have music and events there, and it's become a really important focus of central Oxford. On this corner, another example of regeneration, large scale. This is the Granary building in King's Cross. Now, King's Cross was 53 acres of brownfield site in the middle of central London. It's going to take 20 years to regenerate the whole area. We're only about halfway through now. This building was a grain store, which is now the University of the Arts. And it's a fantastic reuse of the space. That part there, the front facade, is the library. Because it's got big windows, so there's lots of light to be able to use the space. The piazza at the front has restaurants and cafes, and it's become a brand new public space. The area also has lots of residential and new office buildings going up, so they're creating a whole new neighbourhood. Last slide. Top tips. Be strategic. Make sure that you are planning for lots of different eventualities, because it's never going to go the way you plan. And build in resilience, like I said, for growing and shrinking, because your project is going to change, and the economy is going to change, and your funders will change, and the cost of things will change. So just be ready. What happens if? Always ask yourself, what happens if? Prepare for failure, because not every project is going to succeed the first time. Absolutely not. But that doesn't mean it won't succeed eventually. So don't despair if it doesn't work the first time. And keep an open mind, because things will change, and ideas will change, and new ideas will come. And ideas which you thought were wonderful will turn out to be non-viable as well. And think outside the box. You really need to focus on fundraising, diversifying the income streams, campaigning. Make sure that your project is visible. If it's visible, then people will be able to support it. And think about, like I said, meanwhile uses, pop-ups, food stalls, music events. A lot of places, industrial places in the UK, are now being used for experiential events. So the other day I went to a zombie game where you basically went and they had actors dressed as zombies, and you had to run around like, zombies! And then at the end, you escaped the zombies and you could drink a beer. So it's quite a nice use of a building which would otherwise have no function for the time being. And number 6, communication is really, really important. Communicate with your funders, communicate with your stakeholders, communicate with the decision makers. Make sure the important people like you, because then they're more likely to support you. We are very lucky we have a royal supporter who gets us lots of attention when we need it. Make your project visible, have social media presence, make friends with the local press, get people to talk about it. Have a publicity stunt if you need to. In 2011, the UK government abruptly changed the laws on value-added tax, increasing the cost of repairs to 20%, which was a huge shock for a lot of projects that were in the middle of work. Wakefield Cathedral is a good example of this, where they were in the middle of works, the church was a mess, and all of a sudden, because of the change of government, their costs went up by 20%. So the wife of the dean went into the middle of the church with an electric piano and played a song like, "Dear government, this is terrible," and it went viral on YouTube, and was directly responsible for a change by government to increase what was possible to reclaim on your VAT when you repair your church. So that's an example of how powerful social media can be. So make sure that you tell everybody. Also, make sure you celebrate little things, like we fixed the hole in the roof, or we got approval to do this one change, or one funder has said yes, even though now we need 17 more. Every little success is a real big success on the way. And lastly, make it pay. If it cannot pay for itself, it may not survive. So just bear that in mind. And remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint. You're not necessarily going to solve all of these problems immediately. You're not necessarily going to do it in 3 years. It might not even be in your lifetime. But these buildings will be here long after we are gone. They were here long before we were here. And let's make sure that they are still here for our children and their children. So, how do you eat a whale? One bite at a time. Thank you very much.